Hello, friends and family, and welcome back to Author Affairs, where we uncover the story behind the stories. Now, recently I had an interesting conversation with one of the beta readers for one of my current projects. Now, for context, I tend to work on different stories at the same time, so having that feedback and getting that feedback from readers is always important and helpful in shaping how the stories evolve. And during our conversation, she mentioned something that often makes her stop reading and drop a book. She said that if she's about 5 chapters into the story and the writer's still setting the scene, there's a good chance that she'll stop reading. And when she said that, I found it a little ironic, so I laughed a bit because she had just finished reading one of my drafts, and around chapter 5, I was also still setting the scene. But then she pointed out something important. She said that the difference was that the conflict came first. The tension was already there. The problem had already been introduced, and the scene setting and the world building simply followed after that. And that observation stuck with me because it touches on something fundamental about storytelling. And that's what we're talking about today: characters, conflict, and why stories need to start moving early on. One of the debates that you'll often hear among writers is, do you start with stories, with characters, or do you start with the plot? Some writers will say that you start with a character, someone interesting, something complex, someone unique to their own voice. While others will say you start with a situation, a problem, a crime, a mystery, or a conflict that needs to be resolved. Now, in reality, most stories end up needing both because these are two sides of a coin, but it's the same coin. Because writers will often respond first to the conflict, because conflict immediately raises a question. Something's wrong, something's at stake, something needs to be solved. And once that tension exists, readers are naturally pulled forward. They want to know what happens next. Personally, I know exactly what it feels like to want to drop a story because of a lack of conflict. Because sometimes for me, I try to work my way through the story, through the novel, because I respect the work that actually went into the book and the time, the love, and the passion of the writer. But there've definitely been times where I simply couldn't do that. And I think many readers have experienced that same feeling that I did. Because when a story spends too long setting up the world, describing the environment, and explaining the backstories, readers can easily start to lose patience. Not because those things aren't important, but because they don't yet feel the tension in the story. Conflict is what creates momentum. It's what gives the readers a reason to keep turning the page. And without that conflict, readers often have no inclination to keep turning the page. Now, it's important to understand that not every story needs to explode with action immediately, because not every story is an action. Some stories are meant to be slow burns, and slow burn storytelling can be very powerful, but when it's done right. Because here's the difference between a slow burn and a story that hasn't ignited yet. Think about it like this: a good slow burn should feel like a gas stove slowly heating up. You can see the flame, you know the heat is building up, and you know something's happening. But a weak opening sometimes feels more like a candle. It's burning, but very, very slowly. and from a distance you might barely notice it. The key there is, even in a slow story, or rather, even a slow story, should still introduce some form of tension, some form of conflict very early on. Think about films like The Matrix or The Dark Knight, books like The Hunger Games. In both those movies, a lot of time is taken developing the story, but the tension appears almost immediately. In The Matrix, the film opens with Trinity being chased by agents, and before we even understand the world, we know there's a powerful threat. In The Dark Knight, the Joker robs a bank, and that introduces a villain who thrives on chaos. And from that moment, the movie takes its time to explore themes like morality, chaos, and power. But the audience already knows that Gotham is facing a new kind of threat, which will push the Batman to his limits. And in The Hunger Games, which was later adapted from page to screen, the tension appears early when Katniss volunteers to take her sister's place in the games. So the stories may unfold slowly afterwards, but the conflict is already there, pulling the reader forward. The flip side of that coin is having the backstory come too early and well before the conflict is actually introduced to us. As an example, I remember reading a book that it was recommended to me because it touched on some of the themes that I explore in one of my stories. So I started reading chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and each chapter was filled with more backstory information about the main character. More history, more explanation, more attempts to make me, as the reader, care about the character. But instead, something very interesting happened. The more I read, the less I cared. Not because the character was poorly written, but because nothing was happening to challenge the character yet, both internally and externally, in a way that matters to the story. There was no problem, no pressure, no situation forcing the character to act, and that was the issue. Eventually, I reached nearly chapter 10, and I finally asked the person who recommended the book, when does the action actually start here? When does the story actually begin? And that experience reminded me of something important. Readers don't connect with characters simply because they're told their backstory and how they grew up, where they came from, what they like, what they don't like, what their pet peeves are. Readers connect to characters when they see them facing difficulty. When we see a character handle pressure, that's what makes them real to us. That's what makes them human, and that's what makes them relatable. So when writers ask whether stories should start with a character or a plot, the answer may actually be something simpler. Start with the conflict involving the character. Put someone in a situation where something is at stake. Then the reader actually wants to understand the character. Now the backstory matters. Now the world building matters. And now the details have context, because they're helping us to understand the struggle unfolding in front of us. Here's what you need to remember, or what we all need to remember, both as a writer and as a reader. Conflict is the engine of storytelling. And without it, a story may be beautifully written, it may have interesting characters and amazing worlds, but it won't move. And readers will feel that. So combining the character and the conflict fixes the major problem of the opening chapter and the tone of the rest of the story. I hope that helps you in the story that you're working on at the moment. And if you were reading a story and wondering why it wasn't connecting with you, I hope that answers the possible why to that question. So until next time, keep creating, keep dreaming, and keep writing. Stay blessed.